A trembling girl slipped a folded note into a CEO's hand during a high-stakes boardroom meeting. Just 3 words. Your brother lied. She was only 14. No power, no voice, no reason to be believed. But that note didn't just expose a billion-dollar fraud. It ignited a global movement that would change ethics forever. From boardrooms to classrooms, from whispered confessions to international reforms, one quiet truth shattered the silence. What if the smallest voice could rewrite the world? This is the story of the note that refused to be ignored. The conference room smelled of fresh espresso and tension. 12 chairs lined the long mahogany table, each one filled with someone important, at least important enough to be in the room. At the head of the table sat Grant Ellison, CEO of Ellison Dynamics, one of the fastest rising names in American clean energy innovation. 39, unshakable, and sharp enough to slice through legal contracts with a glance, Grant had built a reputation on 2 things, vision and control. Today's meeting wasn't about vision, it was about damage control. Let's walk through the numbers again, he said, tapping his pen on the table as he spoke. His tone was calm, but the underlying current was unmistakable. He wasn't asking. He was warning. To his right sat Marcus Ellison, Grant's younger brother and CFO. Marcus leaned back in his chair, relaxed in a way that made the rest of the room uncomfortable. He'd always been the charming one, bright smile, expensive watch, and the kind of confidence that made you trust him, even when you shouldn't. That same smile rested on his lips now, even as graphs of plummeting investment confidence blinked from the screen. It's a temporary dip, Marcus said. The Everland project got caught in a media storm, but we've got it contained. Most of the press cycles already moved on. Investors haven't, said Carmen Liu, VP of Communications. They're still calling. 3 major funds froze pending transfers this morning. Grant's jaw tightened, and we haven't even seen the full audit from procurement. It's coming, Marcus said. Trust me. Grant didn't reply right away. His eyes lingered on his brother's face, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away. He had built Ellison Dynamics from a shell company inherited from their late father. He had poured every hour, every breath, every sleepless night into it. And Marcus had arrived just as the first big deals rolled in. He had experience in finance, polish, charisma. He'd been exactly what they needed. Until now. The door opened with a soft creak. Everyone turned. A girl stepped inside, clutching a paper folder and a small tablet. She couldn't have been older than 14. Her posture was stiff, her fingers white-knuckling the edge of the folder. She wore jeans and a plain cardigan over a dress shirt 2 sizes too big. Her sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. The assistant, who was supposed to screen the room today, stood behind her, frazzled and red-faced. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ellison," she stammered. "I told her she couldn't interrupt." "It's okay," Grant said, already standing. His voice was soft, calm, the one he used with kids. "Are you lost?" The girl didn't answer. She looked directly at him and took 2 steps forward. Then she handed him a folded piece of paper. Her hand brushed his. It trembled slightly. Grant took the note. The girl turned and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind her. The room was silent. Grant unfolded the paper slowly. In these, written in neat handwriting with the kind of care only a child takes, were 3 words. Your brother lied. His gaze didn't waver. He stared at the note like it might catch fire in his hands. "Who was that?" Carmen asked, her voice cautious. Grant didn't answer. He folded the note again and slid it into his breast pocket. "That's all for now. Meeting adjourned." "But," Marcus started. "Now," Grant repeated. One by one the room emptied. Only Grant and Marcus remained. "What the hell was that?" Marcus asked once the door shut behind the last executive. "Some intern's kid trying to play whistleblower?" Grant sat down slowly. "Did you lie to me?" Marcus laughed, but the sound was thin. "About what?" "About anything. You'll have to be more specific." "Fine." Grant said. "Let's start with Evelyn." Marcus rolled his eyes. "You've seen the numbers." "Don't make me ask again." A pause. Then Marcus leaned forward, voice dropping. "We padded some projections. Everyone does it." "Who's we?" Marcus didn't answer. Grant stood. "Cancel my schedule for the day. All of it. I want a full forensic audit, and I want to know who that girl is. Now." It took 2 hours to find her. Her name was Nora Lane. She lived 3 bus stops away in a public housing complex on the edge of the city. No phone number, no email, no online presence to speak of. Just a school file and a mother who worked late-night janitorial shifts at Ellison HQ. When Grant pulled up outside the building that evening, his driver asked twice if he was sure. He nodded. "Wait here." The apartment door was old, its paint chipped, the numbers barely hanging on. He knocked. It took a long time for someone to answer. Finally, the door opened a crack. Nora stood there. She looked smaller in the hallway light, less like a mystery, more like a scared kid who'd done something big and wasn't sure what came next. "I need to talk to you," Grant said gently. She hesitated, then stepped back. Inside was a tiny, clean space with second-hand furniture and a half-empty fridge humming in the corner. A math textbook lay open on the table. "My mom's not home," Nora said. "I just want to ask one question," he said. "Why me?" Nora didn't sit. She walked over to the kitchen drawer and pulled something out, a thumb drive. She handed it to him. "My mom doesn't know I saw. She cleans the finance floor. She found a stack of papers one night. I took pictures with her phone." Grant stared at the drive. "They're signed by Marcus," she said, "but they don't match the reports in the meeting files." "You understand what this means?" "I'm not stupid." "No," he said, "you're not." She crossed her arms. "I didn't know what else to do. I figured if you didn't know, you'd want to." Grant closed his hand around the drive. "I do." Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Nora sat back down at the table and opened her textbook again, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just changed the trajectory of one of the most powerful companies in the country. Grant left without another word, but something in him had shifted. Not just suspicion, not just fury, something older, like a thread had been pulled that led not just through a lie, but into the past. And he knew, without a doubt, that if he kept following it, it would unravel everything he thought he knew about his brother, his company, and his own family. And the only reason he'd ever seen it was because a girl too young for suits and boardrooms had dared to tell him the truth. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, though Grant barely noticed the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. The thumb drive burned cold in his pocket like it held something radioactive. He didn't need to plug it in yet to know it was real. He'd seen enough of Marcus's casual confidence, enough of those expertly timed deflections to know the girl hadn't lied. He didn't go upstairs when the elevator opened into his apartment. Instead, he walked straight to the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Ellison Dynamics Tower. He still had his key card, still had clearance, for now. The room was dark, silent, the skyline a jagged silhouette outside the windows. He turned on the lamp near the credenza, sat at the desk, and booted up his private system. It wasn't connected to the company's mainframe, a precaution he'd insisted on after a data breach years ago. He was grateful for it now. The files loaded slowly, the seconds ticking louder than they should have. When they opened, he scrolled through each one, reading every line, every signature. Procurement orders that didn't align with capital reports. Vendor payments redirected to untraceable shell accounts. Stacked layers of clean-looking lies. Too clean, too polished. But there were patterns, and the signature, Marcus's, was everywhere. Grant sat back in the leather chair, staring at the screen, the edges of his mind unraveling. He saw his father again, in that small backroom office 2 decades ago, sitting behind a battered desk with a paperweight made of petrified wood and saying, "Family is the only kind of loyalty you don't get to choose. He had believed that, built an empire on it, and now his brother had been stealing from the company, from him, possibly for years. He rose slowly, walked to the window, and pressed his palm against the cold glass. Below, the city kept moving. Cars zipping down avenues, streetlights blinking in rhythm. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He called Carmen first. It was nearly midnight, but she answered on the second ring. "I need a private meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "You, me, legal. Nobody else." She was silent for a beat. "Is this about the girl?" "It's about the truth." She didn't ask more. "I'll arrange it." "And Carmen?" "Yes. Tell legal to come prepared to draft a resignation agreement, but not for me." He hung up. The next morning came with clouds heavy and low, hanging like a warning over the skyline. Grant didn't sleep. He reviewed documents until sunrise, made copies, drafted notes, outlined timelines. By 7 a.m., Carmen and two senior counsel from Ellison's legal team were seated in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor. When Grant entered, they stood. He waved them down. "This stays in this room until I say otherwise." They nodded. He plugged in the drive, played them everything, showed them each inconsistency, laid out the months of forged documents and the shell companies Marcus had quietly used to siphon funds through off-the-book deals under the guise of procurement testing. By the time he finished, no one had questions, only heavy silence. "What's your plan?" Carmen finally asked. "I'm calling a special board meeting, today." "And Marcus?" Grant looked out the window. "He'll be there." The board convened at 3. The 12 members, all hand-picked over the last decade, gathered behind closed doors in the executive boardroom. Most assumed the emergency meeting was a strategy review, perhaps damage control regarding Everlyn. But as soon as the last door clicked shut, Grant stood and placed the stack of documents at the center of the table. "This is about ethics," he said, "and betrayal." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told them everything: the girl, the note, the evidence. His own role in trusting too much, for too long. Marcus entered 10 minutes late, as usual, his tie slightly loosened, eyes scanning the room. He froze when he saw the materials. Then his gaze snapped to Grant. "What is this?" Grant didn't blink. "It's the truth." The next hour passed in slow destruction. Marcus argued, denied, accused. When it became clear he had no defense, he turned cold. "You'd burn me for this company?" "I'm saving the company from you." "You're my brother." Grant's face didn't move. The board voted unanimously to accept Marcus's resignation, effective immediately. Legal escorted him from the building. No press, no scandal yet, just quiet surgical removal. But Grant knew the story wouldn't stay contained forever. That night he found himself again outside the apartment complex with the flickering streetlight. Nora answered faster this time, as if she'd been waiting. "I wanted you to be the first to know," he said. "You were right. He lied. He's gone." She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, and she just nodded. "You gonna fix it?" she asked. "I'm gonna try." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. "You want to come in?" Grant followed her into the tiny living room. Her mother was home this time, seated on the worn couch, folding laundry. She looked up, surprised, but not alarmed. Nora spoke quietly. "This is Mr. Ellison." Her mother stood, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sir, I had no idea she took those photos." Grant raised a hand gently. "She did the right thing, and you don't need to apologize." He sat down on the other end of the couch. The silence stretched a moment, comfortable in its honesty. "I came to ask permission," he said finally. Nora frowned. "For what?" "I'd like to start a new program, a mentorship, for kids who want to be in boardrooms one day but don't have the last names or the money. You'd be the first. I'll pair you with someone on my strategy team. You'd come in once a week, get training, feedback, learn everything I didn't at your age." Nora blinked. Her mother reached out, gently touched her daughter's arm. "You want me to work for you?" Nora asked. Grant shook his head. "I want you to work with me." That was how the Nora Project began. 6 months later, it became a national program. The press eventually caught the scandal, of course. Marcus gave interviews, painted himself a scapegoat. But the company didn't fall. It rebuilt. It reshaped. And at its core sat Panmetusket, one small name on every single strategy deck: Nora Lane, student advisor, junior ethics analyst, mentee turned mentor. The girl who told the truth when no one else would. The girl who saved a company. The girl who made a man see his empire not as a monument to himself, but as a responsibility to everyone who had never been invited through the door. And at the center of it all, folded and framed above Grant's desk, hung a single note: "Your brother lied." And beside it, handwritten in a girl's careful script beneath a new logo, was the second line she'd added a year later. And you believed me. The following spring, Ellison Dynamics hosted its first Youth Ethics and Innovation Conference. The event was Grant's idea, but Nora had overseen almost every detail, right down to the color of the lanyards and the slogan on the stage backdrop. She chose bold yellow for visibility and 3 simple words: "Truth changes everything." The company transformed in more ways than most people noticed. The logo remained. The Skyline Tower still lit the city with its signature deep blue hue, but internally, everything was different. Transparency measures were heightened. Vendor processes were overhauled. An entirely new office, built solely for oversight and youth leadership integration, was named after Nora. At first, she'd tried to refuse the naming. "I'm just a kid," she said. "You were the only one brave enough to stop a billion-dollar lie," Grant replied. "That's not just anything." The mentorship program expanded beyond expectations. What began as a small experiment in inclusion and outreach blossomed into an institution with hundreds of applications from teens around the country. The criteria were simple: integrity, curiosity, and the ability to question what others accept without blinking. Nora returned every weekend. She still lived in the same modest apartment, still helped her mother fold laundry and carry groceries up the 3 flights of stairs. But she also sat in meetings with department heads, asked uncomfortable questions during quarterly reviews, and sometimes caught inconsistencies before any senior manager did. By the time she turned 15, her name had appeared in 3 internal audits, 1 white paper, and a TEDx talk viewed by nearly 2 million people. The talk had been quiet, earnest, nothing flashy. She stood alone on stage and told the story of a lie, a note, and a man who chose to listen. Her voice cracked once when she talked about the moment Grant had looked her in the eyes and asked, "Why me?" "I didn't think anyone would believe me," she said, "but I gave him the truth anyway. And he did something I'll never forget. He believed me, and then he did something about it." The audience had given her a standing ovation before she could finish her final sentence. The video made the rounds. Investors saw it. Partners reevaluated their own internal structures. And young people, too often dismissed as too emotional or too inexperienced, began getting invited to corporate roundtables and advisory panels. Grant watched it happen with quiet pride. He wasn't the star of the story anymore, and that suited him fine. He saw his own younger self in Nora sometimes, not just in her sharp mind, but in the weight she carried, the tension between knowing too much, too young, and still trying to be a kid. One rainy afternoon, he took her to a cafe 2 blocks from HQ. They sat by the window, warm drinks in hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked her. She blinked. "Which part?" "The note. The risk?" She thought for a long moment. "I regret not writing it sooner." He smiled at that. "I almost didn't read it." "I know," she said, but you did." He nodded slowly. "I did." The rain tapped gently against the glass as people hurried by, umbrellas bobbing like slow-moving beetles across the sidewalk. Inside, the cafe buzzed with soft conversation and the hiss of steaming milk. "Do you ever think about him?" Nora asked. Grant didn't pretend not to know who she meant. "Marcus?" She nodded. He looked out at the street for a moment, then said, "Sometimes. Not the version who signed those papers. The one who rode bikes with me in our driveway. The one who held my shoulder at our father's funeral." Nora didn't interrupt. "But that version of him," Grant continued, "stopped showing up a long time ago, and I kept pretending I didn't notice. That's the part that scared me," she said, "that you'd see it and still choose not to." He looked at her. "I almost did." "But you didn't." He reached into his coat and pulled something out, a small folded piece of paper, the same note, creased now from too many readings, worn but legible. "Do you want to keep it?" he asked. She looked surprised. "It's yours." He shook his head. "It never really was. You wrote it. You risked everything, and it changed my entire life." Nora took the paper in both hands, held it gently. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. If I ever write you another note, you'll read it." He laughed softly. "Always." She smiled. "Good." In the years that followed, Nora went on to co-lead the foundation Grant started in her name. She graduated early, with scholarships from institutions that usually reserved them for legacy families and headline prodigies. She turned down 3 Ivy Leagues to attend a small university with a social ethics program she helped redesign during her senior year. Grant remained her mentor, but eventually the world began calling her his. And at every new location of the Nora Lane Integrity Fellowship, a modest room with big windows stocked with binders and courage, you could find a frame behind the welcome desk. Inside it, the note. Not retyped, not scanned, the real one. 3 words, all caps, written by a girl who refused to look away. "Your brother lied." And across every face who saw it, future leaders, CEOs in training, young dreamers with full hearts and empty resumes, there rose a quiet realization. The truth wasn't always pretty, but it was powerful, and in the right hands, it could change the entire world. Years later, the note lived in a museum, not behind bulletproof glass, not in a sterile hall surrounded by velvet ropes, but in a modest corner of the American Integrity exhibit at the National Civic Archive in D.C. It sat in a simple frame, propped up beside a screen looping footage from Nora Lane's TEDx talk, and a quote engraved on the wall that simply read, "She wrote the truth. He read it. Everything changed." Ellison Dynamics had grown, not just in revenue, but in reputation. Grant's decision to expose his own brother had been controversial at the time, but it had become the cornerstone of a new model of leadership. He was no longer simply the man behind one of the country's most promising green energy companies. He was the executive who listened to a child and reshaped a billion-dollar culture because of it. He rarely gave interviews. When he did, he always credited Nora. "You don't always need to be the smartest person in the room," he said once in a panel, "but you should always be the one willing to listen." By then, Nora was in her 20s. Still the same focused eyes, still carrying herself with the quiet presence of someone who'd stood inside fire and walked out stronger. She had turned down a permanent C-suite offer from Ellison to create her own nonprofit, the Second Voice Project. Its goal was to equip youth, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, to speak up within institutions that traditionally never let them in the room. The logo was a stylized envelope with a pencil crossing through it. Each year, Nora selected 20 students across the country to join the initiative. They received training, mentorship, public speaking support, and the most valuable gift of all, someone who would actually listen. She insisted on teaching the first session of every cohort herself. Sometimes the room held kids barely 13. One year, it included a girl who had fled foster care and taught herself how to code on a library computer. Another year, a boy who used sign language wrote an open letter that led to new accessibility policies in 3 school districts. Each time, Nora started the same way, with her story. She told them about the night she slipped a note into a man's hand, how scared she'd been, how certain she was that she'd be ignored, and how that man had chosen instead to believe her. One particular spring, after a session had ended and the building had emptied, Grant visited Nora's office unannounced. He was older now, silver at the temples, lines beneath his eyes, but still carried the same quiet gravity. She hugged him like family. They sat in her office with cups of tea, surrounded by photos of graduates from the program, newspaper clippings, and sketches of future plans. "Did you ever think," she asked, "that it would go this far?" Grant smiled. "Not until I read that note." "I used to think it would be a moment," Nora said. "You know, just a single, brave thing. A firecracker." "And instead?" She gestured around. "It lit a fuse." He nodded slowly, looking at a photo of one of the recent cohorts. "You gave it direction." She looked at him. "You gave it air." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable, earned. Then Grant reached into his jacket. "I brought something," he said, pulling out an envelope. "Plain? Blank." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Another note?" He slid it across the table, and she opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, neatly written, no signature. "Thank you for believing me, not just once, every time. You made the world safer for people like me. You made me believe I could speak. You reminded me that truth, even when small, is still mighty. Yours was the first hand that didn't let go." Nora looked up. He met her eyes. "From one of your students. She gave it to me last week when I visited a solar facility in Oregon. Said she was in your second cohort." Nora blinked fast, trying to keep the emotion from spilling. Grant stood. "I wanted you to have it." She rose too. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The boardrooms? The pressure?" He chuckled. "Sometimes. But watching what this has become, watching what you became." He shrugged. "I wouldn't trade a single minute." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You still have the note?" Nora nodded, walking over to the filing cabinet by her desk. She opened the top drawer, pulled out a thin folder, and carefully withdrew the worn slip of paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained sharp. "Your brother lied." "And still," Grant murmured, "one of the bravest things I've ever seen." She replaced it, closed the drawer. "It wasn't about revenge," she said. "It was about clarity." "I know," he said. "That's what made it powerful." As he left, the door clicked softly behind him. Nora sat at her desk and turned her attention back to a new application. A 13-year-old girl from Texas who had flagged corruption in her school's funding process. She'd attached a scanned image of a note she'd slipped to a school board member. Nora smiled. History didn't repeat. It echoed. And every echo started with one brave truth, one note, one moment, one person willing to believe. By the time the third annual Second Voice Summit convened in Chicago, Nora Lane had become a household name in circles far beyond corporate ethics. Her influence had seeped into policy-making panels, educational reform committees, and even international forums where youth voices were typically included only as afterthoughts. She never raised her voice to be heard. She simply spoke with a clarity that made people quiet down so they wouldn't miss anything. The summit had outgrown its modest origins. What began as a small gathering of youth leaders and advocates in a rented conference room now filled an entire convention center. The keynote stage was backed by a mural-sized projection of Nora's original note, enlarged, digitized, and flanked by stories of change that had rippled outward from it. It was tradition now. The opening keynote would always include that note, and the closing would always belong to someone else. A student, a whistleblower, a young person who had dared to say, "This isn't right," and lived to see something good grow from it. This year, that person was 13-year-old Mateo Rivera from San Jose, who had exposed embezzlement in a nonprofit meant to help immigrant families. He stood on stage in a too-big blazer, with his fists clenched at his sides and tears streaming down his face. The crowd stood before he finished speaking. In the audience, Nora rose too, her eyes shining. Grant Ellison sat beside her, more of a supporter now than a symbol, dressed plainly in a charcoal sweater and slacks. He hadn't stepped on stage in over a year, but his presence still made waves, especially for those who remembered what it had cost him to choose integrity over loyalty. After the summit, they walked the Riverwalk in silence. The city buzzed around them, unaware of the weight they carried between them, like old friends sharing a secret. Grant broke the silence first. "He reminded me of you." Nora smiled softly. "Me too." He was terrified, and still showed up. Grant stopped to lean on the railing. "You know, there's something I never told you." Nora looked over, eyebrows raised. "That morning after you gave me the note, I almost ignored it." She waited. "I was angry, embarrassed, afraid I'd look weak if I questioned my brother publicly." "But you didn't," she said. He nodded. "No, I didn't. Because something about the way you handed it to me, it wasn't desperate. It was certain, like you knew I'd read it." She looked out at the water. "I didn't, but I hoped. I think that's what saved us both." They stood for a while, listening to the sound of traffic echoing from the streets above, the slow rush of water beneath the bridge. Finally, Nora spoke. "I've been thinking about writing a second book." Grant turned. "Yeah?" "About all the notes, not just mine, Mateo's, Alia's, even the anonymous ones, the messages that changed something because someone had the courage to speak." He smiled. "You should call it Believed." Nora blinked. "That's exactly the title I had in mind." He chuckled. "Of course it is." When they returned to the summit venue, a new box waited in the speaker lounge. No note, no card. Just a plain manila folder inside with a printed article and a handwritten message in a child's handwriting. "I think you'd want to know. My uncle is hiding stuff. He says the company's fine, but I saw him delete emails before a meeting. I don't want anyone to get hurt. My name is Aiden. I'm 10. Please help." Nora closed the folder slowly, her hand pressing over the cover like it was something sacred. Grant looked at her. "What now?" She looked back at him, steady. "Now?" she said. "We read it, we believe it, and we do something." And they did. They reached out to Aiden, verified his story, brought in the right people, protected him. The company in question began an investigation, then an overhaul, and another child found out that telling the truth didn't have to mean being alone. It never got easier. The lies were always sophisticated, the fear always present. But what changed, what stayed changed, was that now there was a door, a number, a name, a woman who had once written a note and refused to be silent. One night, months later, Nora walked into her office to find an envelope resting on her desk. No name, no seal. She opened it carefully. Inside was her original note. "Your brother lied." Folded beside it was a second paper, newly written in Grant's handwriting. "Because you spoke, I listened. Because I listened, the world changed. Because we both believed, it didn't stop. And it never will." Below it, a simple signature, G.E. She placed both notes into a new frame, not for a museum, not for a gallery, but for her desk, so that every time someone walked into her office, shaking, unsure, carrying something heavy, they would see the proof that it mattered, that it worked, that one note could light the fuse, and one hand believing it could keep the fire burning forever. When Nora stepped on stage at the United Nations Ethics and Governance Forum in Geneva, she wore no jewelry, no designer name on her sleeve, no rehearsed affect. Just a charcoal gray blouse, clean lines, and that same unwavering voice that had once belonged to a terrified teenager holding a piece of paper. Now it filled a room of global delegates, CEOs, prime ministers, and analysts. She didn't stand behind the podium. She stepped in front of it, hands open, shoulders steady. "I'm not here today because I was born into power," she said. "I'm here because I was brave enough to speak and lucky enough to be heard." The audience leaned in. She told them about Grant, about the boardroom, about how the real beginning wasn't the lie, it was the belief, about how she slipped the note to a man with the authority to bury it, and instead, he excavated it, let it change him, let it cost him. She talked about the students, about the thousands of children around the world who had, since then, written their own truths on napkins, on receipts, in text messages sent to anonymous inboxes. She told them about the girl from Kenya who exposed a food distribution scandal, about the 15-year-old in Seoul who triggered a revamp of a corrupt school entrance exam process, and about the 11-year-old in Kentucky who saved his dad's factory job with a single drawing he mailed to a journalist. "The world doesn't need more gatekeepers," she said. "It needs more listeners, and it needs more children willing to write the note." When she finished, there was no applause at first, only a profound stillness. And then, as if a weight had lifted across the room, the sound came, not polite, not ceremonial, but bone-deep and rising. The kind of applause that didn't just honor what had been said, it affirmed it. Afterward, Grant met her in the wings. He had watched from the front row, hands clasped in his lap, heart pounding not from fear but from pride. "You just changed something again," he said. Nora shrugged lightly. "I didn't. The truth did." Later that year, Second Voice opened its international headquarters in Brussels. The office, designed by youth fellows, included a mural along the entry corridor. It depicted a faceless child holding a note with its edges lit like a spark. The hallway led to a circular rotunda, a deliberate rejection of traditional corner offices where no single person sat at the center. It was built for conversation, collaboration, decisions made with many voices at the table. On the far wall hung Nora's original note, beneath it etched into brass. "Every system depends on silence to protect itself. Every truth threatens that system, and every brave whisper cracks it open." N. Lane. At home, Nora still lived in the same apartment complex she had grown up in, though now in a unit 2 floors up. Her mother refused to move elsewhere. "This place saw our beginning," she said. And in many ways, the world now came to them. College students seeking guidance, corporate liaisons looking to replicate ethical initiatives, young reporters asking Nora how it felt to become a symbol. She always answered the same way: "I'm not a symbol, I'm a start." One night, Grant joined Nora and her mother for dinner. They ate empanadas around the kitchen table. No advisors, no press. Just 3 people who had walked a road few others had the courage to even begin. After dinner, as they washed dishes side by side, Grant said softly, "I worry sometimes." Nora didn't look away from the suds. "About what?" "That someday a kid will write a note and no one will read it." She rinsed a plate. "That'll happen. It already does. But we're not trying to stop every injustice. We're trying to make believing the first instinct, not the last resort." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you ever wish you hadn't written it?" Nora turned toward him. "No," she said, "because that wasn't the hardest part." Grant blinked. "It wasn't?" She shook her head. "The hardest part was trusting someone would read it, that the note wouldn't just disappear into the room like every other thing kids try to say." "You gave it to me," he said. "Why me?" "Because you looked like you were still listening." Grant didn't know what to say to that, so he nodded. As he stepped out onto the quiet street later that evening, he reached into his coat and touched the inside pocket, a habit still. No note there now, just memory, a permanent imprint folded into the fabric of who he was. Above them, the stars were unusually clear. And far away, somewhere in a different city, a boy sat alone at a kitchen table. He scribbled on the back of a homework sheet, chewing the inside of his cheek. The words came slowly but surely. A truth he'd seen, a risk he knew was real. He folded it carefully, and tomorrow he would hand it to someone. and maybe, just maybe, they would read it. And the story again would begin. The following spring marked 5 years since Nora had written that first note. Not long in the span of a lifetime, but long enough to watch a legacy take root. By then, Second Voice had partnered with over 40 companies, 9 government agencies, and dozens of schools worldwide. There was now an app co-designed by students that allowed users to report ethical violations anonymously but securely, with each submission automatically reviewed by a panel of young advisors trained in oversight, empathy, and integrity. The app was called Whisper. Nora had resisted naming it after herself. "This isn't about me," she told the developers. "It's about every person who's ever been silenced." The app's logo was a folded note, tilted slightly to resemble a flame. On its launch day, the servers crashed from the number of submissions. It was a sobering reminder, not of the app's success, but of how many children, teens, and employees had been waiting for someone to build a door. In a quiet ceremony that month, Grant handed Nora a small wooden box engraved with the date of her first meeting in the Ellison Dynamics boardroom. Inside was the original thumb drive, the one she had handed to him in her tiny apartment, evidence trembling in her fingers. He had kept it all this time. "You should have this," he said. Nora looked down at it. "I don't need it anymore." Grant smiled. "I know, but someday someone else will." She placed it beside the framed note on her desk, neither hidden nor flaunted, just present. A reminder of where it all started. Nora's mother, Carmen, still worked late hours, but not as a janitor anymore. She now managed youth outreach for the foundation. She and Grant had formed an unlikely friendship, forged in long nights and shared pride, and every so often they laughed about how neither of them had imagined this, their children becoming architects of global change. One rainy evening, as Nora was locking up the Second Voice headquarters, she spotted a girl no older than 10 sitting alone under the awning. The girl looked up as Nora approached, eyes wide. "You're her," the girl said. "The note girl." Nora knelt down. "My name's Nora. What's yours?" The girl hesitated. "Alani." "Hi, Alani. Are you waiting for someone?" The girl shook her head. "I walked here. I thought maybe someone could help me." Nora unlocked the door again and let her inside. She made tea, wrapped Alani in a soft blanket, and sat across from her in the small lounge area. When Alani finally spoke, it came out in a whisper. "My brother says if I tell anyone what our uncle does, we'll have to leave. He says we'll get in trouble." Nora didn't speak. She didn't press. She just listened. "I don't want to get him in trouble," Alani continued, "but I don't want him to hurt anyone else either." Nora reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You're not alone," she said. "You're brave, and you just did something very, very important." Alani looked at her. "Will anyone believe me?" Nora nodded slowly. "Yes, because I do." They started the process together that night, carefully, with the right contacts, the right protections. And Alani became the next in a growing line of young truth-tellers whose stories wouldn't be buried. After Alani left with a caseworker and a warm hug, Nora stood alone in the center of the room. The windows fogged slightly from the storm, soft yellow light casting long shadows across the floor. She walked to the wall where her original note hung and looked at it for a long time. Your brother lied. What had once been an act of rebellion, of fear, had become something else entirely, a symbol of what could happen when power and truth stood in the same room and didn't look away from each other. Behind her, the printer hummed to life. She turned. A fax was coming through. An internal report from a partner company, flagged by an intern with questions about a missing batch of donation receipts. Another note, another whisper, another fuse. Nora walked over, took the paper, and smiled, still helping, still listening, still reading. And on desks around the world, in inboxes and voicemail messages and handwritten slips of paper tucked under doors, the echoes of one folded note continued to travel. Because someone had once dared to say what everyone else was afraid to. Because someone else chose to believe it. And because the world hadn't stopped listening since. By the end of that year, Nora's note had been translated into 43 languages. It appeared in textbooks on ethics, in training manuals for corporate onboarding, in the orientation slideshows of law enforcement agencies, humanitarian nonprofits, and school boards across continents. A photograph of it hung in the main hall of the Global Youth Assembly in Copenhagen. A student in Beirut painted it as a mural across her school's back wall. A boy in Bogota tattooed a folded envelope over his heart, with 3 bold words beneath it. Tell the truth. And still, through all of it, Nora Lane never let the world shape her into something it could claim. She turned down invitations to become a senator, to serve as a global ethics consultant, even a lucrative offer to host a documentary series about whistleblowers. She told them all the same thing. This isn't about fame. It's about faith, in people, in the idea that someone will listen. Instead, she stayed where it began, quietly rebuilding systems from the inside out, training new cohorts of Second Voice Fellows, meeting with young truth-tellers behind closed doors, sitting on the floor with them, holding their hand if needed, and reminding them that silence wasn't the cost of survival. One day, a package arrived, no return address. Just a thick manila envelope with her name typed neatly on the label. Inside, a short letter written in handwriting that took her breath away. It read, "I never thought I'd write you. Not after everything. I've watched from afar. I've read the stories. I've seen what you built. I was wrong. I was weak. I was everything you exposed and more. And still, somehow, you've never used your story to destroy me. You used it to rebuild something better. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't expect it. But I needed you to know. You were right. I lied. And the world is better because you didn't. No signature, but she knew it was Marcus Ellison. She folded the letter once, then again, and slipped it into the drawer beside the original note. Not for revenge, not for closure, simply for truth. One more piece of it. She didn't need to respond. The world already had. Later that month, she stood at the front of the annual Second Voice Gala. The room was filled with over 1,000 attendees. Students, former fellows, educators, corporate allies, elected officials. Her team begged her to use a teleprompter. She declined. Instead, she stepped onto the stage and simply said, "I want to thank someone who's not here tonight. Someone who wrote to me." She paused. Someone who once did enormous harm and has spent years carrying that weight. Someone who lied, and then, when the world changed around them, told the truth. The room was completely silent. "I forgave them," she said softly, "not because it was deserved, but because I remember what it felt like to be believed. And the only thing stronger than telling the truth is knowing it's not too late to start." Applause didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was thunderous, rising like a wave across the marble ballroom and crashing against the chandeliers with the sound of relief, of recognition, of reverence. Afterward, as Nora stood by the note once more, its frame now encircled by signatures from all the students who'd come through the program, she traced her finger along the creases of the paper. "Your brother lied." What a strange small sentence to carry so much weight. To have rewritten a family, a company, a culture. The note had always been a warning, but now it was also a promise. That someone would believe you, that systems could be better, that silence was not safety, and that a girl, just a girl, could change everything with the right 3 words, written with a steady hand, passed to the right person at the right time. A woman approached her as the crowd began to thin. She was young, maybe 20, in a blue dress and well-worn sneakers. "I'm Anna," she said. "I was in the first year of Whisper submissions. I just got hired to lead internal audits at my university." Nora smiled. "Congratulations." Anna hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret writing it, that day?" Nora looked up at the wall, at the note, then out at the sea of lantern-lit tables, at the kids who now walked taller because they had the language and support their predecessors didn't. She turned back to Anna. "No," she said. "I regret that I waited as long as I did." Anna nodded, then slowly took a piece of paper from her purse, folded into thirds, unlabeled. "I wrote one too," she said. "My professor never read it. I kept it anyway." Nora took the paper and opened it gently. It read, "I saw, I spoke. No one listened, but I'll speak again." Nora looked into the girl's eyes and reached into her own purse. She handed Anna a pen. "Sign it," she said. Anna did. Then Nora folded it, walked to the wall, and pinned it right beside the original. More followed, dozens, hundreds. The wall became a collage of whispers, of warnings, of resilience. The truth was no longer a single note. It was a choir. And Nora, still the girl who once passed a folded scrap of paper across a boardroom table, stood among them, not as a hero, but as a mirror, reflecting back to them all the courage they'd carried all along. On the 10th anniversary of the original note, Ellison Dynamics hosted a private gathering at its flagship campus. Not a press event, not a fundraiser, just a reunion. An evening filled with the quiet gratitude of people who had once stood at the edge of silence and chosen instead to speak. The guest list was small, no executives angling for quotes, no influencers looking for content. Just Nora, Grant, Carmen, and a room full of the earliest believers, the first cohort of Second Voice Fellows, the app's initial developers, whistleblowers whose lives had been irrevocably changed by a folded piece of paper and the choice someone made to read it. A single white envelope sat in the center of the welcome table. Inside it, a copy of the original note, printed on thick card stock. On the back, a question was printed. "What truth did you carry?" Every guest wrote their answer and pinned it to a memory wall that stretched along the far end of the room. By the end of the night, the wall was full. Some messages were a single word. Others were stories. All of them were echoes. Nora stood in front of the wall long after most guests had left. The last note she pinned was her own, that the world would break me if I spoke. But it didn't. It built something instead. Behind her, Grant joined her silently. His hair was more salt than pepper now, but the weight in his gaze had softened with time, not hardened. He looked at the wall. "You know, this is more than I ever dreamed that paper would hold." Nora nodded. "It was never about the paper." He tilted his head. "It was about someone finally choosing to read it," she said. "To listen, to act." "You give me too much credit." "No," she replied. "I give you exactly enough. The rest belongs to every person who read their own note and didn't look away." A hush fell between them. Then Grant said something he hadn't before. "Do you remember what I said when I saw the note?" Nora smiled faintly. "You didn't say anything. You just folded it and put it in your pocket." "I said something before that," he corrected gently. "When I first saw you, I asked if you were lost." She looked at him. "I wasn't." "I know," he said. "I was." They laughed softly, but the air between them crackled with memory, with reverence. He reached into his coat, the same inner pocket 10 years later, and pulled out the real note. Not a copy, not a scan. The original, still creased and faded, but intact. Still legible. He handed it to her. "You kept it," she said. "Every day," he said. "Until now." Nora took it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She turned it over, then back again. The ink had smudged just slightly along the folds. A fingerprint stain had ghosted one corner. It had survived boardrooms, scandals, speeches, and history, A simple human object, almost ordinary, until you read it. She held it against her chest for a long moment, then looked at him. "I want to frame it in the new wing." He nodded. "It belongs to everyone now." The new wing, still under construction, was designed by youth, funded by whistleblowers, and named the Echo Chamber. Not in irony, but as a reclamation, a space where truths were not shouted into voids, but caught, amplified, believed. Each visitor would pass under an arch etched with a quote from Nora. "The bravest thing you can do is write the truth and believe someone will read it." A few weeks later, the note was framed behind museum-grade glass and placed under soft lighting at the entrance of the echo chamber. No velvet ropes, no dramatic spotlight, just a plaque. The note that changed the culture, written anonymously, handed over quietly, read fully, believed completely, acted upon immediately. Visitors passed it every day. Some lingered, some wept. Some reached into their pockets and pulled out scraps of their own. And every single one of them understood this wasn't about a girl or a company or a scandal. This was about what happens when someone listens, when silence loses, when truth becomes a beginning, not a punishment, and when, finally, the right hands reach across the space between fear and action and take the note. Years later, when the world had grown even louder and more complicated, Nora stood in front of a classroom filled with students who had not yet been born when she wrote her note. The chalkboard behind her had been replaced by a digital screen, and the desks had sensors that could adjust based on posture. But some things remained unchanged, like the knot in a student's stomach when they wanted to say something that felt too big, or the way an entire room could hold its breath when someone dared to speak truth. She held up a single folded slip of paper, blank, untouched. "This," she said, "is still the most powerful thing I've ever held." The students leaned in, not because of what it said, but because it was handed to someone who could ignore it, and they didn't. She passed it to the first student. "Write something you're afraid to say. You don't have to share it. Just give the truth somewhere to live." One by one, they passed the paper around. Some wrote quickly. Others stared at it for long minutes. By the time it returned to Nora, the paper was worn, its creases softened by many hands. She didn't read it. Instead, she placed it in a small wooden box on her desk and closed the lid. "Sometimes," she said, "you don't need to read the words to know they matter." That box traveled with her for years, to forums, to classrooms, to crisis response centers and UN peacekeeping offices. Each time, it collected truths, folded confessions, hopes, warnings, admissions, apologies. When the box grew full, she started another, and another. At the 30-year mark, when the world asked for her memoir, Nora declined. "I've already told my story," she said. "Now I'm making room for others." Instead, she curated a book, 1,000 scanned notes, chosen from over 50,000, submitted anonymously to the Second Voice Network. The book was titled simply The Folded Word. It debuted at #1 across every major platform. But more importantly, it became a tool. Teachers used it to start conversations. Lawyers used it in ethics training. Survivors kept it on nightstands. Journalists cited it in articles. Whistleblowers kept pages bookmarked. The final page was hers, one paragraph. "I was 14 when I wrote a note and handed it to someone who could have torn it up. Instead, he put it in his pocket." And the world shifted. Not because I shouted, not because I had proof, but because truth doesn't need volume. It needs a listener. Be that listener. The page opposite was blank, encouraging whoever held it to begin. And they did. Again and again and again, even after Nora passed away at 84. Peacefully in her apartment, the notes didn't stop. They came to her office. They came to the foundation. They came folded into flowers, into packages, into the soil at the base of trees planted in her name. each one marked with initials, with shaking handwriting, with ink blotches and creases and coffee stains, each one still changing something. Her memorial was not a spectacle, just a quiet ceremony in the courtyard of the First Second Voice building, the original note sealed beneath glass in the earth beside her. A girl approached the microphone at the end, barely 12, hair in braids, eyes determined. "I didn't know her," she said, "but I wrote my first note because I saw hers in a book, and someone listened. So I guess that means I knew her after all?" And the world nodded, because everyone had. She was the quiet in the room before the first brave word. She was the hand that held the door open for truth to walk through. She was the note that was read, and the silence that never returned. A year after Nora's passing, a new initiative was launched in her honor, the Read It Project. It wasn't a building or a digital tool, not a conference or an organization. It was simpler than that. It was a global day, one day each year, dedicated to reading the unread. Teachers cleared part of their lesson plans to sit and read notes submitted by students. CEOs suspended meetings to read through anonymous feedback from their staff. Families sat at dinner tables with folded pieces of paper placed beside plates, each person encouraged to write one thing they hadn't been able to say aloud. Libraries became sanctuaries for confessions. Parks became message boards, and subway walls hosted murals of anonymous truths. No judging, no questioning, just reading, just listening. The first Read It Day was celebrated in 32 countries. By the third year, it reached over 80. No cameras, no branding, no ads, only the promise, you write it, we'll read it. That day, a young boy in a refugee camp in Greece wrote, "I don't want to be afraid to ask for help." His camp's coordinator saw the note posted on the community board. She changed the intake form the next morning, adding a space where children could anonymously request items or services. The boy received clean clothes and a private session with a counselor within the week. In Tokyo, a corporate assistant posted a folded note in the break room. "I wish someone would ask how I'm really doing." Her supervisor recognized the handwriting. He didn't say anything, but the next morning he knocked on her office door and said, "I'm not here for a report. I'm here to listen." In Detroit, a girl taped a note to the outside of her school counselor's door. "I've been holding my breath all year. I'm tired of being brave and alone." The counselor canceled her afternoon meetings and found the girl sitting alone in the art room. She didn't say, "Why didn't you come sooner?" She said, "I'm here now, and I brought breath with me." Every year, millions of new notes found light. And every year, the legacy of Nora Lane, once just a trembling girl with a note, reignited in the hands of people who believed they were too small to matter. The original note now lived in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Second Voice World Archive in Copenhagen. Only 4 people had access. But a perfect replica traveled from country to country, displayed like a sacred document. And when students on field trips asked, "Why this one?" the guides always gave the same answer: because it changed everything. Not because of who wrote it, not because of what it exposed, but because of what it became. The folded note, the silence breaker, the beginning. Eventually, the world would forget the name of every CEO who ignored a warning, every official who buried a complaint, every board that turned the other cheek. But it would never forget the note that didn't get torn, the voice that didn't get silenced, the girl who trusted that the truth, even if written quietly, was enough, and that someone, somewhere, would read it. 50 years after the day Nora first walked into that boardroom, the world she helped shape stood on different ground. It was not perfect. There were still systems that buckled under the weight of hidden wrongs, still boardrooms that bent to power before principle. But there was now something that had never truly existed before, a universal expectation that truth had a place to be written, a place to be read, a place to be honored. The Nora Lane Institute for Ethical Courage opened its doors in the same city where her note was first written. The campus spanned 5 buildings but carried the humbleness of her original vision. On every wall, framed notes, real ones, submitted from across the decades. In every classroom, students not just studying ethics, but living it, practicing how to say the hardest things in the gentlest ways, and how to respond when someone else said them first. The central courtyard had a sculpture that students often ran their fingers across as they passed between classes. A simple bronze casting of a folded piece of paper, its edges smooth and worn from generations of touch. It sat atop a granite base with a single inscription: "You are not too small. Your words are not too quiet. This is where truth begins." Each year, a new cohort of young people would arrive at the Institute, wide-eyed and carrying their own versions of the story. Some had already written their notes, others hadn't yet found the courage. All of them understood one thing: they were part of a lineage now, not of rebellion, but of resolve. The final wing built on campus was called the Whisper Vault. Inside it was a circular archive, no angles, no corners to hide in, where over 1 million notes were housed. Digitally stored, yes, but also printed, folded, and filed with care. Some were on torn notebook paper, some typed neatly, some barely legible from tears or urgency. Together, they formed a living history of human honesty. And in the center of the vault, in its own case beneath a dome of light, was the note. The note. Nora's note. Still creased, still whispering. Visitors came from all over the world to stand before it. Some knelt, some wept. Some pulled pens from their pockets and began to write. On the 100th anniversary of the note, the world marked it with a global moment of silence, not for Nora's passing, but for what almost never happened, for what nearly stayed hidden, for what could have been ignored, and for what was not. Children in classrooms across continents sat for 60 seconds, each holding a blank piece of paper. At the end, they were told, "You may write something, or you may just sit, but remember, there will always be someone who will read what you dare to say." In that moment, across oceans and time zones, one voice became many. The folded notes began again, in new hands, with new truths, and every one of them carried the same quiet promise: "You are not alone. We are listening. We are reading." Still, long after Nora Lane's name had been etched into textbooks and murals, long after her story was taught in ethics courses and civic studies, there remained one place that preserved her legacy, not in bronze or glass, but in motion, a small room in a modest home tucked along the outskirts of the city where she had first handed over the note. It wasn't a memorial, not officially. There were no velvet ropes or security guards. It was just the room her mother had kept exactly as Nora left it. Light streaming through faded curtains, the desk still stacked with books marked by sticky notes in her handwriting, a coffee mug filled with dried pens, and, at the center, a thin wooden box. Visitors who came were carefully chosen, not by fame, not by wealth, but by reason. Each had written their own note, real ones that had changed something, revealed something, healed something. Each had asked to see where it all began, and when they stepped into that room, they never spoke right away. They looked, they breathed, they sat on the floor or by the desk and just listened, as if the walls were still carrying Nora's breath, as if truth itself was suspended in the dust motes that floated gently in the light. Eventually, someone suggested they call it the first room. It stayed that way. Each person who entered was invited to write their own letter, to Nora, to themselves, to the world. These letters were placed in a basket beneath her window. Every year the Institute would collect them, transcribe them, and bind them into volumes. They called these books the Ongoing Note. Hundreds of volumes, each one filled with quiet courage. One year a former whistleblower returned, now a grandmother, retired, silver-haired but fierce-eyed. She opened the latest volume and traced the lines written by a teenager from Nepal who had uncovered abuse at a regional training center and exposed it despite threats. Below the story, the girl had written, "I read the note. Then I wrote my own. Then I read someone else's. That's how it keeps going, right?" The woman closed the book and whispered, "Exactly." In the courtyard of the institute, a stone bench bore no name, only a carved quote. Fold it, write it, pass it on. Students touched it for luck before interviews. Staff placed notes there on hard days. On the anniversary of the note, people from around the world mailed in folded papers to be placed beneath the bench in bundles wrapped with yellow ribbon. Some were messages of hope, some of pain. All of them written with the faith that someone, somewhere, would care enough to read them. Because Nora had, because Grant had, because now the world did. In that same year, a boy named Amr wrote a note about a data falsification case at his robotics lab in Cairo. He passed it to a visiting mentor from Second Voice. The note was simple. "It isn't big, but it's wrong. I thought maybe someone should know." The mentor read it, investigated it, and within months, Amir's note had helped recalibrate ethics oversight protocols across dozens of institutions. He was later invited to the first room. When he sat at Nora's desk, he didn't cry. He didn't write a speech. He took a piece of paper and simply wrote, "I was heard," and that was all. The original note still rested in its case, untouched since its final placement in the echo chamber. Time had yellowed the edges, but not the words. They remained bold, stark, undeniable. Your brother lied. It was no longer just about betrayal. It was about what happens when truth is finally seen. It was the first pebble in a landslide of justice, the first whisper in a chorus of clarity, the first flicker in a wildfire of change. And as new generations stepped into their lives, into their rooms, into their courage, they knew what Nora had proven to be true, not with a speech, not with a rally, but with one small note passed across a table. If you write it with your whole heart, and if the right person reads it, the world will never be the same, not ever again. The girl stood in front of the fountain. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her coat was buttoned wrong, shoes scuffed, the sleeves a little too short for her growing arms. In one hand she held a piece of paper folded so many times its corners had gone soft. In the other, a crumpled envelope from a place she'd never dared to walk into until today. She was visiting the Nora Lane Institute on a school field trip. Her class had wandered through the ethics exhibit, the echo walls, the mural halls where folded notes lined the corridors like prayer flags from every corner of the globe. Some students giggled, some took selfies, but she had been quiet, still, watching the notes, reading the words written by people who had chosen, in their own terrifying moments, to write what others wouldn't say aloud. Now, in the plaza that curved like a crescent moon around the central fountain, she approached the reflecting stone. It was just a slab of marble, pale gray, carved with the outline of a folded note. Below it, the plaque said, "You are not waiting for permission. You are writing what must be read." She knelt, opened the envelope, slid her note inside. She whispered to the stone, as if it could hear, "I didn't know who to tell." Then she slipped her envelope into the narrow bronze chute just beneath the slab, one of hundreds embedded throughout the campus, designed for truth-tellers who weren't ready to speak aloud. The system behind that chute was quiet, dignified. Volunteers, educators, and trauma-informed staff read each one in a protected room nearby. The notes were never dismissed. Some were flagged for legal escalation, others for mentorship. All were honored. The girl didn't wait to see what would happen. She stood and walked back to her class with a little more steadiness in her step. Her note was retrieved 3 hours later. Inside, in the barely legible scrawl of a child still learning to spell, was written, "My mom's boss touches her back when she doesn't want him to. She doesn't say anything, but I see it. I think someone should know." That note became one of hundreds that month to trigger action. Not scandal, not spectacle, but quiet, immediate advocacy, support services, accountability, change. One note, like always, one folded cry from someone small and unseen until they weren't. It was this model that eventually found its way into parliaments and courts, adopted by governments that previously ignored or punished truth-tellers. Second Voice became more than a nonprofit. It became a framework, a standard, the baseline for any institution that claimed to value accountability. Before signing any charter, before taking any oath, leaders were asked to read 3 random notes from the Global Archive. Some wept. Some broke. All emerged changed. In a hospital in Johannesburg, a note written on the back of a food wrapper stopped a doctor from being reassigned after patient neglect. In Oslo, a child's single sentence exposed a smuggling ring. In a detention center in Arizona, a folded napkin passed between detainees led to reunification of families who'd been separated for years. Truth had stopped knocking. It had found a key. One day, while visiting a satellite campus of the Institute in Nairobi, a student asked the guest lecturer a question. What would have happened if Nora never gave the note? The room was still. The teacher, once a note writer herself, answered without pause. Everything would have stayed exactly the same. Silence, then. But because she did, nothing ever stayed the same again. Across oceans, a child lay in bed that night with a note tucked beneath their pillow, waiting to be delivered. Across a boardroom, a man reached into his jacket and ran his fingers across a folded confession he had yet to read. Across a village, a girl climbed onto her roof with a flashlight and held up a piece of paper toward the stars, her first truth, written in the dark. And somewhere deep inside the quietest corners of the world, the first note still echoed, still fluttered like a banner over every whisper, still reminded the brave that their voice, when written, folded, and given away, could become a light in the locked rooms of the world, a map to the door, and a reason, at last, for someone to walk through it. In a corner of the Second Voice World Archive, tucked away between the shelves of global notes and transcribed impact journals, there sat a nondescript wooden box labeled only with a brass plate, unread. Inside were notes never claimed, never followed up on, never traced. Notes from anonymous senders or places too unstable to investigate. They were not forgotten. Each year, one day was dedicated to reading through the contents of the unread box, a quiet ritual, no press, no fanfare. The readers, trained volunteers, legal observers, and survivors, took shifts in a soundproof chamber where each note was read aloud into a microphone and recorded. Some notes were barely a sentence. Some pages were torn in half. Some were written in languages no one could yet decipher. But every word was heard, and as each reader left their shift, they passed under the same stone-carved phrase etched above the exit. Even if the world never knew what you risked, we did, and that makes it real. Nora had once said that truth was the only currency accepted everywhere, but only when someone had the courage to spend it. In her final years, she established the Anonymous Archive Fund, a global trust that ensured resources for any whistleblower whose safety or support system disappeared after speaking out. The fund was never advertised, but those who needed it always found it. One such beneficiary, a young man named Idris, later became the chair of the Truth Infrastructure Board for the United Nations. His work eventually led to the first international requirement that all publicly funded institutions include a second language ethics portal and an independent note-reading body. He told people he never would have survived without the fund. He also never met Nora. But he carried her note in his wallet, laminated beside a photo of his sister. It reminded him, he said, that the truth was worth it. even if it broke you, especially if it freed someone else. At the 1000th volume of the ongoing note collection, the curators created a special edition, gold-trimmed, thread-bound, embossed with the original folded note on the cover. Inside, at the final page, was an insert written in Nora's hand years before she passed. A sealed envelope. The curators debated whether to open it. They consulted her mother, her peers, her trustees. Finally, with reverence, they did. Inside was a message written on cream-colored paper in the same pen she had used for the TEDx talk. If you're reading this, it means the truth has continued. I am proud of you, not because you exposed something, but because you knew what it would cost and still walked forward. Keep folding, keep writing. Remember, the quietest voice changes everything if someone reads it. You did. You are, with all my belief. N.L. The page was placed at the center of the archive beneath soft light and protected glass. People traveled from every continent to see it, not just to look, but to write. Beside the letter was a writing desk, a drawer of paper, and a stack of envelopes. Some wrote confessions, some wrote promises, some wrote hope. All folded their notes and slipped them into the wooden chest labeled Next, because there would always be another truth, another voice, another folded message that would make its way across the noise and the silence and the apathy of the world, to a hand willing to take it, to a soul willing to read it, and to a future willing to change because of it. This was the story of Nora's note. This is the story of every note that came after. And it is not finished. Because someone, somewhere, is folding the truth right now, and someone else is waiting to unfold it.